So I think one of the basic ones is to learn how to do healing of trauma that we all have. I think it's the number one obstacle to peacefulness and sustainability is to heal. And we don't have very good ways of doing it collectively, and very few ways of doing it individually. The truth and reconciliation process has happened a little bit in certain parts of the world, South Africa, Ireland, Rwanda. But sometimes there's been a little bit too much on the forgiveness side rather than the justice side of that.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we speak about making a difference in our communities and families using a Buddhist perspective for deep listening and connection with Dharma teacher and facilitator John Bell. I had the pleasure of reading an article recently in the area of social justice, and it got my attention. This article did. It's in Cosmos Journal. The title was "Developing a Mindful Approach to Earth Justice Work" by a gentleman named John Bell. And I don't know John. Just got through meeting him here before hitting the record button. And it looks like there's a remarkable amount of overlap in perhaps how we frame the world, how we experience the world. We'll find that out. But for sure, some of our experience seems to have some parallel. So it's been really fun to get to know John here at the first level. And really in the same track that I've been introducing in the past couple of months, and certainly plan on deepening in 2020, I'm asking John to join us today to really bring one of the most pervasive, one of the most potent tools that I've seen used in my lifetime and in my research about how to reclaim our agency in life in general. That's the framing I would put around this whole topic. And that is how to bring Buddhist methodologies, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist ways of being into daily life in a way that is graspable and applicable to people from all denominations and in all communities around the world. Because it really just seems like it's the time to call on all traditions, all wisdom traditions, and all useful tools to be brought to the table for us to share with one another. And that's really why I wanted to contact John, because the article itself does just that. I have had some experience doing a little bit of research and a little bit of practice in Buddhist methodologies. I am not a practicing Buddhist. And what I found in John's article was that it really was a primer of sorts, an introduction to those very tools that I was hoping could be laid out by someone who knows far more than I do and has far more experience and practice. So, John Bell, I'm doing a really lame job of introducing you. I'm not speaking from your bio, which is briefly included at the end of the article, which, by the way, I will, of course, put the link to in the show notes here in this podcast. And John, I'm wondering if you would just start out by giving us a little bit of introduction to who you are and how you would like to be introduced and known in the world. And welcome, warm welcome to the Poetry of Predicament.
Hmm. Thank you very much. In the Buddhist way, we have a bowing in practice to acknowledge. We offer a lotus flower. It's not a prayer position. It's a lotus flower, seeing the Buddha nature, the God nature, the creative force in you. So thank you very much. I enjoyed looking at your website. Feel real kinship. I grew up in a small working class naval shipyard town, Bremerton, Washington, surrounded by beautiful Douglas fir trees and Mount Rainier and the Cascades and water all around. And I was nourished by that beauty whenever it got too bad in the house, or I would just climb a tree and look out of the mountains and felt that peacefulness and groundedness. And I grew up loving this country. Naval shipyard town gave me a sense of security and power, and I collected little statues of the presidents and loved all the words of the founding fathers kind of thing, of liberty, justice, happiness for all. Really took it in very deeply. And then I was 16 in 1960, so 16 to 26 in the decade of the 1960s, when all hell broke loose. And I began to learn about the underbelly of this country and felt betrayed. It felt like I had been sold a bill of goods, that it wasn't those ideals that I took in so deeply. Felt bereft, became an angry younger man, became a Marxist in my thinking. I grew up Catholic, and that fell away, learning all about the Catholic, the Crusades and the violence perpetrated by my church, and couldn't really, as a young man, just growing into my consciousness. And read Gandhi when I was 16 for the first time. He had a different worldview and was a revolutionary. So I began to read the Bhagavad Gita when I was 16, and then got involved in the social justice, the anti-Vietnam War. Susan, I have a little phone ringing here. We'll just think of it as a mindfulness bell. I got involved in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, was arrested and, did protest, but never seriously harmed because I was white. But I always felt like, well, there's something wrong here. There was too much anger in the peace activists. There was too much one-wayness in the civil rights, just my rights. And I felt like there was something else missing, some grounding. And I kept coming back to Gandhi, who refused to demonize the opponents. He realized we were all children of earth, children of the creation. And he even went first, I remember his first in South Africa. He went on his first big march to try to get rights for Indian South Africans. He called it off because General Smuts, who was the leader of South Africa at that time, was also hit with a railroad strike. And he said, no, I want General Smuts' full attention because he has to be transformed in this process. And that had a lot of integrity for me. And he wasn't about anger. He was about calling people to their higher nature. And so I began to turn towards Eastern thought more and more. And then I had, in my 20s, I had about a dozen hallucinogenic drug trips, acid and LSD and mescaline. And they were profound religious experiences for me. I was high for like 10, 12 hours. And in that time, there was a heightened sense of reality. I thought everything looked different and more vibrant and tasted different. And I was more alive to it. And I realized I must have been sleepwalking through my life. And the other thing is that happened is that coming down took a lot of time, and I felt like I was being closed back into a smaller worldview, isolated, unattached, disconnected. And I started to cry like I'd never cried before. And I realized I had a lot of inner emotional work to do. And that turned me to healing processes. And I came across a peer counseling methodology, which really I've done for the last 40 years or 45 years, which has really opened up the process of healing. So the three things in my life, which then sort of are at the center, are social justice, spiritual practice, and emotional healing. And one without the other two seems to me to be incomplete. And for years, I was involved in youth development worked helped organize a program called Youth Build, which worked for the young people who've been out of school and out of work, ages 16 to 24. They spent about a year in the program creating housing for low-income people and learning GED and leadership skills, and transformed their lives as a result of this engagement. And the other was the Children of War, where we brought young people from 18 different war zones around the world to talk about their experiences. And what I learned there is the universal mistreatment and disrespect of young people, which we call adultism. And they told their stories, and we organized young people. So come now to the present, I'm mainly in the Buddhist climate action arena, working on the issues around earth justice. And I guess just to put the headlines up front, viewpoint is an extremely important place to start. Where do we stand on this? Here's an example. In the Battle of Sarajevo in the early 90s, there was some of you may know this story, there was a cellist who went out into the town plaza while they were bombing, started playing the cello. And somebody from the press came along and said, "Why are you out here playing music while they're bombing?" And he said, "Why are they bombing while I'm out here playing music?" And so that perspective really changes things. You know, what's primary here? The story about, the old stories you may have heard about, somebody goes into the entrance of a cave and sees a snake and wants to flee, and then someone else comes along, shines a flashlight, and it's a coil of rope. So the same percentage, what we bring to a situation makes all the difference. So one question I ask is, what's the story we're telling ourselves about the climate situation? Here, I wrote down, actually just a few weeks ago, I was thinking about this. I wrote down, I don't know what this is useful or not, but here's some things I've heard out there, narrative we hold about climate change. Do we think humans are the problem? We're selfish, short-sighted, and driven by greed? Or do we think the climate is past the tipping point of recovery, game over? Or short-term thinking will doom us to long-term collapse? Or social collapse is inevitable, environmental catastrophe likely, human extinction possible? That's Jem Bendel's position. Or governments and corporations won't move fast enough to avert the worst. Or we can't achieve climate justice without racial and social justice, and there's not enough time to do that. Or we'll descend into fascism and authoritarianism as the social conditions deteriorate. Or technology will solve the problem. Or I've heard this, it's God's plan, the rapture is coming, bring it on. There's that out there. Or climate crisis is a relationship problem. We need to reclaim our connections. Or what if the climate crisis is just the right challenge to slingshot humanity to a higher consciousness? Or doomsday narratives are just stories. We can change those narratives. A couple more here. The spiritual truth is that nothing lasts, impermanence rules, and including our civilization and our species. So acceptance of that is a spiritual wisdom. And lastly, in order to love ourselves, love the earth, we need to love ourselves. So healing ourselves is healing the earth. So my sort of personal stance is, I think this is an amazing time to be alive. Amazing time to be alive at this point in human history, because we're being asked to call forth the better angels of our nature. And we have to, it's asking fundamental questions about who we are, where we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
How do we live, given that we're facing the end of nature as we know it? And to me, it's like an exciting time to be alive. We don't know how the story ends. We don't. There's predictions. There's other narratives, doomsday stuff. And we're in for a lot of suffering for sure. But how it ends, we don't have any idea.
Yeah. That's an extraordinary and powerful list of questions and points that you've just laid out. I'm curious if you could start us out, perhaps following the track that you described in your article. You laid out 6 elements of Buddhist framing of a situation that might be useful,
Okay.
if I can understate it for a moment.
Yeah.
In these times, and I think each of them, it's going to be easy enough to see how each of them could hold a portion of that list that you just read to us.
Yeah.
And I want to, before we do anything with that list from your article, I want to touch in on a little bit of conversation you and I had before we hit the record button here. We both had done some work with youth programs, one of which you just described your experience. And I was sharing my experience of how working with youth, I worked in a youth at risk program in the UK and the USA for almost 20 years. And what I experienced was I could have all kinds of lofty transformation-based curriculum that I'm working in my own practices and I'm using in my other work with executives and so on. And there was a immediately humbling experience of trying to bring any of that in its lofty form to the youth program. Just didn't work. It didn't work without bringing it into some more accessible, reachable, translatable, shareable form. And so you've just asked some equally humbling questions. Those were solid, really important questions and points you just read out from your list. In the same way that our engagement with youth in those programs was humbling and grounding, let's take any amount of that list that you just read out and just bring it to your article and some of the these Buddhist tenets, if you will, or methodologies or framings, if you will, and let's just see how to talk about it in a real way that talks about daily interactions and daily motivations that we might experience in our lives, and see if we can make any inroads on any of them, any of that list that you just said, if you wouldn't mind. I'd love to do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It's an interesting framing. I'd like to start back with the youth work, because I can pull a lot from that. I worked with both staff who worked in these youth build programs, of which there are 260 now around the United States, with an $80 million federal appropriation. It's a national program. It's now also been adopted in 15 other countries. So it's been quite successful as a model of youth development, youth leadership. And, you know, I was older, I was white, I'm a man, I'm working with younger people, mostly of color, 16, 24 years of age. Many of whom have been down a hard road. A third of them have been incarcerated. A third of them were young parents. So they weren't going to, but they want the same thing that you and I want. They want safety. They want a sense of belonging. They want to make a difference. They want to love themselves. They want to be able to take care of their families. So the problem is, I don't think of the framework as just a Buddhist framework. Mm-hmm. I think there are elements that are just universal. Some of them are informed by Buddhism for sure. And we'll get to that in a second. But so partly it's how do you translate something universal into language that people, like Buddha was very good, speak to the people that you're in the language that they can understand. So with the young people I worked with, I would do a several-day retreat with them, a workshop called Stress for Success. Everybody has stress, sign me up, but I want to succeed. So you right in there in the title, there's the aspirational part and the acknowledgement that there are some obstacles, my stress. Stress is kind of a non-threatening word. It's like everybody has it. Well, Buddha says suffering exists. So I would just say stress exists. The second noble truth of Buddhism is there's a cause of suffering. So when the stress thing, I would say the cause, we just outline what are the stresses in your life? And they just fill a whole wall with the stresses. Sometimes they do it in pairs, sometimes we do it publicly. Lots of stresses. And they could see they weren't alone in those stresses by just saying them out loud. So where's the source of stress? Well, sometimes you can say it's outside, but really people have survived the worst conditions and still been happy. So most of the stress is right here in our minds. We create a lot of stress by the perception. Is it a snake or is it a helpful coil of rope? So really looking at our minds, understanding what's going on in our minds is essential to freedom, to be happier and free and less stressed. And the third noble truth of Buddha is it is possible to have a stress-free mind or to understand freedom of that kind. I would do a retreat with the young people. I forget what the name of it was. In addition to stress for success, it was like having a free mind in a rigid society, you know. And then the fourth noble truth is a pathway. So I'd get them into a room and I would teach them to meditate, just observe the mind, breathing in and breathing out. And I would have the staff say, well, that girl over there, she's hyperactive. She won't be able to stay still. I say, well, have her sit next to me. And so she'd sit there and I would just do a slightly guided thing, you know, just notice and pay attention to your breath. Very easy, relax your body, you know, Don't worry about anything. You're safe right here in this moment. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And she was stone cold, concentrated. She loved it, you know. People don't have those kind of invitations to be quiet. There's so much jangliness, media, and restlessness and violence sometimes in the environment. So to have the permission and the guidance to just be quiet. I have a good friend at the Youth Build program who is an African-American man who takes young people out into the woods just to have an experience of quietness. He puts them along a stream at a couple hundred yards each and just has them sit there for half an hour individually. And then they come back together and they say, what did you experience? And they say, well, for the first time I could hear myself think, or I began to just feel how beautiful it is to be here, or I started to cry because I never had this kind of peacefulness. All these kind of very, very concrete things. So then you come to the healing part. What do you do with the stress or suffering or, climate grief? We have lots of different names for it, but it's suffering. Human suffering is human suffering. We all have it. We all have it to one degree or another. Nobody, suffering is part of life. So it's helpful to have some tools to deal with the suffering, with the stress. And so we would teach things like handling your physical self. So exercise and stretching and good nutrition and healthy sleep habits, that's part of it. The other is, having a community around. You choose your friends right? Another is mastering your mind. Another is really handling your emotion, your activity. So we teach a whole thing of deep listening to each other, really listening to each other. If you look at all the therapeutic processes, some of them look very different on the outside, but at the center of it is a human being listening to you. That's what's therapeutic. Because we got hurt in isolation.
Right.
And to have somebody pay attention. And the thing that I think, one of the key things, when I give talks about climate change to folks, I say, those feelings you have of despair and powerlessness and grief and anger you have about climate change, they were there long before you knew anything about climate change. They come from our early childhood experiences, our inherited ancestral trauma, our intergenerational trauma. And so as we heal those things, and we need to, we will also be freeing our minds and our ability to act in the climate space. So that sort of brings me to this 6-part framework. You can see I've already touched a lot of the pieces of it. Should I just elaborate a little bit, or do you have another question?
Well, I do have another question, and I'd like to just pause going into the meat of the article for just a moment, because in reading your bio, John, you mentioned in there that you are both a father and a grandfather, and you have this extensive experience working with youth in the way that you were just describing. Makes total sense. I can see why and how you put together that kind of curriculum for the young people. And I guess I would like to just take a couple of moments, take a little chunk of our time together right in the middle. My experience is that just in the past 5 years or so, that we've gone to a very different level of what's going on the planet and our collective awareness of it, whether it's willful or invited knowledge of what's going on, awareness of what's going on in the world, or whether it's just if it's hitting us in a and we're being reluctant in taking on that knowledge. I want to actually just read one of the first paragraphs in your article to kind of let people know what you're seeing when you're framing your article. I think it's going to be very similar. It's going to be familiar, a lot of familiar words for the folks who watch this podcast. Our beloved Mother Earth is hurting, and we humans are the cause of this suffering. There's a growing awareness of the immensity and unprecedented nature of our current situation. Some climate scientists and academics have declared that we are headed toward inevitable social collapse, probable environmental catastrophe, and possible human extinction. This occurs at a time when the world is stressed by racial and social oppression, population growth, and overconsumption, an unfair distribution of resources, and an extractive growth economy. And my experience of the extent of the truth you were telling in that paragraph is that's a new awareness for us on the globe. You know, we've been kind of reluctant to take on that level of truth telling. I'm wondering if you have anything to say coming from those words. It seems like the ante has been upped. You know, the youth program that I worked 15, 20 years ago, yes, life was tough for them, and we had to do the processes that we did, similar to the ones you did, to be able to bring forth new ways of seeing the world, new ways of engaging with the world, new levels of awareness for our own body and lives and so on. And I'm wondering if you would just speak to us for a moment as a father and as a grandfather, and then as the Dharma teacher that you also are and have been. Is there any way in which this more dramatic level of urgency of our world challenges and predicaments, is there any way that that shifts the nature of what you share and how you share it? Has it changed you as a father and as a grandfather? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Mm. Mm. Yes. Well, I don't think anybody 250 years ago sat down one day and said, ooh, I'd like to create some processes that are going to cause human extinction and extinction of so many species. Mm-hmm. I think all of us humans, we like less stress, more comfort. We like things that make our life more enjoyable. So we discover coal, and we discover oil, and we discover, and we invent things, and we, you know, and they create consequences. And here we are, 250 years later, facing the results of actions that were unintended consequences. There's no one to blame here. There are forces. And I think so my children, you know, I practice a set of ethics that in the Buddhist tradition, sometimes they're called precepts. Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been my teacher, has reframed them as mindfulness trainings. And the 5 are this, and this is one of the pieces in my framework. So,
Right.
we're sliding around here. But, this is a long way around to answer your question. So I have it in mind.
Okay.
So the first one is do no harm, or love, reverence for life. So and another one is not stealing or generosity. It's framed both in a positive and negative way, each of these. So we're stealing, for instance, the future from our children by our actions now. The fact that we like our internet connections like this, and our televisions, and our air conditioning in our cars, and the heated homes that those of us in the West are privileged to live in, and it is a privilege. That's using up, it's taking resources from the Earth's systems, and therefore stealing from our children and grandchildren a quality environment in the future. And in the past, present and the past, our distress habit energies, our distress recordings, of greed and oppression, have made us steal quality of life and environment and land from peoples in the past. So we have genocide and slavery and, child sex trade, all this kinds of stuff, which are stealing. So to live with generosity and not stealing, how am I stealing the credit of somebody by not acknowledging how my thinking stands on their good work? Another of the 5, so reverence for life, being kind to everything, not stealing, kind speech. Look how toxic our environment is now, the polarization in the democratic countries. And to practice kind speech, real kindness, understanding that, there's a human being who has different views than me, but don't demonize them. Engage in compassionate dialogue. Try to change points of view through love, understanding really what their point of view is. We could make a lot more human progress if we just sat down and listened. A third one is what's called true love. Said differently, it's sexual responsibility, not engaging in sexual misconduct. So the Me Too movement is just the tip of what's been millennia long patriarchy and abuse around sexuality. So to really aspire to live with love at the center, not sexual desire, that can relieve a lot of stress and suffering in the world and exploitation. And finally, mindful consumption. One part of it is easy to understand, that we consume things that use up the resources, but there are other levels of consumption to really be aware of. We're consuming toxic information through the media, through movies, through newspaper. We're taking in nutriments that are not really nourishing as we do these things. Conversations, gossip, slander, we indulge in that. And that causes disease, stress, stresses the system. And we kvetch to each other, we complain. And that's taking a lot of mental energy. So how does this relate to my children? I cannot save them from a future with a lot of suffering. They will have their suffering. You and I have our suffering now. They will have their version of suffering. The more species will die. We can't save them from that existence. What I can do is try to create as much happiness, contentment in my own life, and share that exude that as much as possible and try to teach by the way I live, teach my children and grandchildren a way of being that finds happiness internally and not in external conditions. External conditions are going to change. They'll probably get much worse for people all over the world. And so the big question for us humans, I think, is how do we prepare ourselves for that and handle it? And this is why I come back to another part of this framework. And I want to, as I look at these things, think of them as interacting like a Rubik's Cube, or in Buddhism is called an Indra's net. Indra's net is a web where there's jewel at each node, and that each jewel has facets which reflect all the other jewels. Mm-hmm. So it's very interconnected. So I think one of the basic ones is to learn how to do healing of trauma that we all have. I think it's the number one obstacle to peacefulness and sustainability is to heal. And we don't have very good ways of doing it collectively, and very few ways of doing it individually. The truth and reconciliation process has happened a little bit in certain parts of the world, South Africa, Ireland, Rwanda. But sometimes there's been a little bit too much on the forgiveness side rather than the justice side of that. So how do we, Thich Nhat Hanh years ago put out this idea, which I still think has a lot of merit. He says, in the United States, why don't we have, respected spiritual leaders convene a group of people representing different constituents of our population, and each have them tell their story. Well, all the networks cover it. Just hear people talk about what's it like to be a young Black man, a young lesbian woman, a Jewish person, a person with physical differences, an older privileged white person. What is, because we all have our stories, and we've all been pitted against each other in an oppressive system run by greed and ill will and the delusion. So that at the heart of the Buddha's teaching, he said that all of our suffering, individual and collectively, is due to three things: greed, hatred or ill will, and delusion. And the delusion is the delusion that I'm separate from you. And the conditioning around separation is immense in our country, in the world. I was just in the woods the other day up in New Hampshire, out in the deep snow. It was snowing, went out for a walk with some friends in silence. And I just realized how cut off I am from the natural world. How cut off I am from knowing what trees do, how they're related to each other, how the animals, how the sunlight, how the processes support my life. Yeah. And I'm just unaware of it. Mm-hmm. How and food, cut off from the sources of our food. So
if I could just pause you for a second, John, I really appreciate a couple of the points you've just made in particular, and I'd just like to revisit them for a moment to emphasize them. First, back at the beginning of you're starting to share your story, you mentioned some sort of peer counseling methodology that you've been using for years. I'm wondering if that has a particular name and if you could share that with us.
Yes, thank you for asking. It's called ReEvaluation counseling, sometimes called co-counseling. And it basically, in short, says that we are by nature, we're inherently caring, powerful, creative, cooperative. And the only reason we don't show up that way is we get hurt. Yeah. But those capacities get hidden and buried and repressed. And the way, and that if you notice, humans have a built-in way of healing. You can see it most clearly in babies and children. When they get hurt, what do? They cry.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody has to teach them how to cry. We have
Right.
to teach them how to stop crying. Shut up, I really give you something to cry about. Or here, or look at the birdie, or have an ice cream cone, something to distract them, because people mistake the release of feelings for the source of feelings.
Right.
So if you can encourage the release of feelings, I remember my daughter, when she was a toddler, came in, she stumbled across the threshold, fell, and had a major cry. Now, it wasn't about that little thing, because she didn't really hurt herself much. But, you know, she exists in a big world. She can't reach things and doesn't understand things, and things are confusing, and it's scary for a little person in a big world. So she was taking this opportunity to kind of release all of that bent up stress, if you will.
Yeah.
And had I shut it down, that has one consequence, but I was able to hang with it, say, that must really hurt. Yeah, keep telling me what that's like. She didn't have a lot of words and conceptual stuff. It was body feeling and emotional. And after 15, 20 minutes, she was back to her sunny self instead of being, you know, sulking or kicking the wall. So, so we now, in our age, have accumulated, we've carried forward a lot of the hurts that we picked up. I can tell a short story. Yeah, can I do this?
Sure.
I was walking along Broadway. I lived in New York for 20 years, and I was walking on Broadway about 112th Street, hot summer day. A little boy on about 7 or 8 or 9 maybe, came riding on a bicycle on the sidewalk. And 10 yards ahead of me, he fell off his bike. He was in shorts, and he skinned his knee. And I could see a little blood starting to come up. And he was going like this, you know, trying not to feel it, because he was a boy. He was taught you shouldn't cry about your hurts. So I kneeled down. I came up and I kneeled down. I pointed to him. I said, that must hurt. He said, yeah, it really hurts. It really hurts. You know, and he looked up. I said, every time he started to stop, I said, that must still hurt. He said, yes, it hurts. And he kept looking, who is this guy, you know, who's just standing here? And because I just stayed there, and here's a human being who's hurting and needs to express it, then you know what he did then? For the next 20 minutes, he lifted his shirts and showed me all the scars that he had and told me the story about it. And then he got on his bike and happily rode away.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, wow, how many scars are we carrying around that we're just waiting for the opportunity to share with somebody what that story was so we can release it.
Yeah.
So that's what the co-counseling process does. For the last 33 years, for instance, in my case, I've been meeting with a man, and every Wednesday I go to his house, and next week he comes to my house. We split 90 minutes. So he listens to me for 45 minutes without advice, without an agenda, a sacred space of listening. And then I listen to him for 45 minutes. So I cry my head off. I get mad as hell. I feel a fear. I shake with fear, you know. I laugh at all the light fears and embarrassments and things like that, because it piles up. And if we don't have these ways to do it, so and that's the thing I love about this, is it's very accessible.
Yeah.
Because it's you and I, we agree to do this. There's no fee. We just provide each other that sacred listening space.
Yeah. So I just want to name something that's kind of uncomfortable for me, really, since the beginning of our talk, which is that we have a ridiculously short period of time to try and cover what we were both agreeing could easily be days of conversation. So I think I'd like to just declare that we will have at least a part B of this conversation at a later date. And there will be so much we will not cover. And really, to be fair, I don't think we're going to get to much of this article that was the original source for why I wanted to connect with you. Because, John, right now, I just want to pause in this place and speak to what an overlap there is, again, in what you're sharing and my own experience, and especially in this body of work that I'm putting together to serve people who see the world in very much a very similar frame to that first paragraph from your article that I just read. You know, we're really up against serious existential level concerns on this planet that have never been, humanity has never had to face this conversation before, these elements before. And so I love that we are ending up talking about the actual practices, the no kidding practices that a concerned person would want to take on. The way that I frame it is that our work is to reconnect. What got us here into this predicament is that we've disconnected from all the primary sources of meaning in human life. Deeper self, other people, earth, and soul. And so all the practices that I bring to the folks that are listeners or participants in some way or another with this body of work, all those practices have something to do with reconnecting. And people just pick and choose their own practices that fit with their particular needs and their desires in their life. I want to just really validate what you were just sharing with the co-counseling in your particular realm. I have a few practices that and lineages that I've been a part of for years for the kind of healing that you were talking about. And you particularly mentioned the healing of trauma. And I think what I was hearing you say was not just the individual trauma, like the kind that happened to us from being a young boy that skins his knee and so on, all the way through the individual traumas that we might experience in our lives at every level, but also the collective trauma. Mm-hmm. That there are very real ways that are well said in your article. The number of them are beautifully laid out in your article. I want to just speak to the gathering process that I've been in, and I've been able to touch into some other sources of healing for individual and collective trauma, and also for self-regulation, to be able to go from a dysregulated state when I'm knocked off track by life. You know, you were mentioning the little girl that just, there was so much going on, and she really had far more going on than just a little incident that happened to her. Mm-hmm. And that what she needed was to be able to express and be heard and be felt and be related to in such a way that she could let some of that out. Mm-hmm. And to be able to get some space back. So from the smallest example of that kind of healing to the grandest, most collective and large scale examples of that kind of trauma and healing, there's a guy that I get to interview from time to time. He's a designer of human systems out into our future. So if we could have a truly sustainable way of living as human beings on Earth, what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would we do? And in my interview with him, I particularly focus on his what his perspective is on what are the skills that a concerned person would want to have. What are the skills and capacities they'd want to have in order to be able to participate in this new world that you're designing? His name is Joe Brewer, this designer. And his quick answer was they'd want to have advanced self-regulation skills, and they'd want to have psychological flexibility. Now we go into a lot of detail about both of those, but I think they fit remarkably well. Your framework that is in this article that we're talking about has so much to do with the psychological flexibility. Mm-hmm. You know, obviously from the spiritual practice, but also through the psycho-spiritual, all the way to the daily pragmatics.
Mhm.
There's a psychological flexibility that's built into each of your points in your article, each of these tenets. And then this advanced self-regulation. So I just wanted to overlay that with what you've been saying, that there's so much overlap. You say it differently, you have slightly different lineages and form to the things that you're sharing, but it seems like essentially they're basically the same. From what you've been doing to work with kids, to work with to how you've been holding it in terms of your own family.
Mhm.
So interesting that there's then this overlap with what Joe Brewer is suggesting that people may want to work on as they look into how do we create a new world? How do we go from this extraordinarily troubled world we're looking at and living in now
Mhm.
to something new and bold and different?
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if there's anything that I've just recapped or reframed that sparks you to say anything.
Beautifully said. I totally agree about that. So much of it is relational, that we've lost our relationships, our closeness with each other. We're longing to be close. We're longing to belong. And so, uh, there are some practices that I use. One is to, as much as possible, to soften and relax and let go of my views of how I want things to be, because nature is much bigger than my conception of it. Things will not turn out the way I'd like it to be. It doesn't mean that I give up, but I just need to soften. Second thing is to really go back to my body as much as possible. How is it feeling right here? Really re-inhabit this body. Another one is what we were saying, heal all the early hurts. And they are both individual and collective. That's why the second piece of Mother Framework is to really heal the racial and social inequities stuff. Another one is fall in love with Mother Earth. One friend I have said, well, take a particular part of nature, an animal, a species, something, and just learn about it. Nurture your awareness of it. Take it in. Notice how it's related to your life. Just one piece of it and then move out. Another one, just a couple more, is whenever I feel alone or better than someone else, worse than someone else, disconnected from someone else, scared of someone else, what I can know is that I'm deep in my conditioning around separation. And to notice, just notice all the times I feel separate. I once, when I was in an airport, you know how you're in an airport in a crowded public space and you're sitting and waiting, you make up stories about people that pass by, it's just like very judgmental stories. And I realized how corrosive that is. And so I made a little mantra for myself that I repeat whenever I'm feeling separate. And wherever I am, I say, this is my home and these are my people. This is my home and these are my people. And right away, it changes my relationship to those folks. I feel a friendliness, an interest. The judgmentalism drops away. This is my home, right where I am. And these are my people, right here. That's a very helpful practice. Two more things, practical things. One is really try to embody those mindfulness trainings, to practice kind speech, to be kind towards other beings, to practice true love, to really be mindful of my consumption. And the last thing is, I love Bobby McFerrin's song, Don't Worry, Be Happy. I play that a lot. I use it in my retreats and workshops just because it's a very happy tune. I don't mean to be light about what we're facing, but As a friend of mine I just read yesterday, he was saying when people ask him, well, how are you feeling about things? And he says, we're screwed and we're blessed. So even if, as the world collapses, even as, things change, there's still so much beauty in the world. The spring comes still. The birds still chirp as long as they're around. There's so many places that we can find nourishment if we have that, if we're looking for it. If we're looking for the downers and the bad news, we'll find that too. That comes back again to the first where I started. Depends on our point of view. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your good questions. Thank you for the work you're doing. And for all your listeners who are watchers, thank you all for, caring enough about Mother Earth and your children and grandchildren and the species. It's not all about us humans either. It's, we're not the center of creation. We may not exist. All things perish. Everything that has the nature to arise will pass away. That's repeated in Buddhist teachings all the time. All things that have the nature to arise will pass away. And how do we live with that? And for me, it's not just grief that brings up, it brings up gratitude for this particular moment. And I can't hold this moment, it changes. So
Yeah.
if I can learn to ride that, arising and passing.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much.
Well, John, it has been a pleasure to speak with you, and you're right. Back when we first got on the call, that it would take days to come anywhere near running out of topics for conversation here. I really hope against hope that this is not our last conversation, because it seems like my experience is that we're just brushing up against the edge, an important edge of this conversation, where there is a kind of a rawness in my experience. The rawness is the depth of what you just said, taken to a remarkable extreme. Like to be able to let go. I began my meditation practice close to 50 years ago. And I thought along the way, oh, I really know what it means to let go. I know what they meant by letting go. I get it. Yeah, I know I got it. And then a couple of years later, or a couple of months later, or a couple of minutes later, I might discover, no, there's actually more letting go to do. I think there's a depth, certainly in my experience, there's a depth of what we're all facing now that is very, very different. And these tenets, these principles that you've been laying out so clearly, so well in your article, and that obviously Thich Nhat Hanh brings us that gift from that lineage. It's quite extraordinary. I'd like to invite us to start at this place in our next conversation and really challenge ourselves to look at many of the circumstances around the world that would challenge us to hold them. They're so large. They're so charged with that existential level vibration, if you will, that I think there will be immense value there. If we could meet again, if we could start there and challenge ourselves to cover some ground that human beings haven't had to cover before. How does that sound to you?
It sounds fine, and I'm happy to come back. If I could just say one thing about that.
Oh, please, anything.
Just as a teaser, I guess,
Yeah.
next conversation. Because we have internalized so much feelings of powerlessness, we look out at climate change and we say, oh my God, it's too big. It's beyond. Maybe it's not.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Well, John Bell, it has, again, been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being flexible in the agenda for today, because as I mentioned, we barely touched your article. And I, again, will put that article and the link to it in the show notes. It has been a pleasure, and I've so appreciated your willingness to share about your the elements of your life so generously with us, your work history and your family and yourself. So thank you again. And I really look forward to that next conversation.
Thank you. And you're a very good facilitator and interviewer.
All right. Well, thank you.
May the fruit of our practice benefit all beings on the earth.
Mm.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.